paraphernalia.
He's wearing a Seahawks boxers, right?
That's right.
It's not for a mass attention.
Well, with that as our lead in.
My sleeve tattoos are covered.
All right. Well, we're live. So welcome to the third Legislative Studies virtual workshop. We're here today. We're going to discuss and comment on Craig Goodman's paper, Managing the Senate Agenda, Exploring the Majority Party's Procedural Options. And just to sort of go over the ground rules real quick. So the way we'll do this is I'll moderate today. I think we'll have everybody go ahead and go down the line and introduce themselves soon, in just a second here. And then I'll moderate. We'll kind of go around and offer comments by section of the paper. So, typically the way we've done it is we do sort of intro or big picture framing issues first, and we talk about theory, and then research design, and then empirics. And then we kind of, it's a free-for-all after that with sort of anything that got left out. And we're not overly rigid, so if you feel an overwhelming desire to sort of jump around a little, that's perfectly fine. If you want to jump in at some point, just raise a finger like that. I'll try to keep a queue of people who are waiting in line to sort of comment on the immediate point. That'll be that. So why don't we start, I don't know how they're arranged on everyone's screen, but why don't we start with Craig going in. Craig, actually we'll go with Craig last. So Tony, why don't you introduce yourself first, and then we'll go down to Jordan and Jason and Greg, and then Craig.
Sounds good. Thanks, Nate. Thank you guys for having me. My name's Tony Madonna. I'm an associate professor now at the University of Georgia. Need me to say anything else on this?
No, that's it.
Great.
All right, great. Yeah, thanks for inviting me, guys. I'm really honored to participate in this. My name is Jordan Ragusa, and I'm an assistant professor at the College of Charleston.
Jason.
I'm Jason Roberts, associate professor at the University of North Carolina.
Greg.
Gregory Koger. I'm an associate professor at the University of Miami, and I study Congress.
Craig, you go ahead, and then if you want to follow with any kind of a few words of context about the paper, feel free. Otherwise, we'll open it up.
All right. I'm Craig Goodman. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Houston, Victoria, and I'm excited about this workshop because this is a chance for me to kind of revive a paper that I worked on a long time ago and just kind of got buried on some stuff. So I'm looking forward to the feedback from y'all, and hopefully getting this paper in shape to send out for review and hopefully find a home for it somewhere.
Okay, great. All right, anyone want to volunteer to start? We don't have to call on the class. I guess I got to call on the class.
Nate, actually, I'd like to hear from you. I mean, why motions to table? In what sense is this a means of controlling the Senate agenda?
Yeah. So, well, I usually reserve I get to go last since I'm the moderator. So I'm gonna make. Tony, Tony, you want to jump in?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. So we take this paper in order. That's kind of the deal.
Yeah, usually we try to do framing stuff, big picture first, and then kind of move along.
All right, so throughout this, I like the paper, and having just published a paper on historical usage of the motion to the table, a lot of the comments I'm going to give are going to be framing-related comments, and here's something these 12 reviewers hated, because we went to a number of journals with our piece too. So, but yeah. Enjoyed the piece. So I guess just starting it off on the theory end, something they kept going after us about is there wasn't a ton here, I think, especially up front, about why we should be interested in this. And you actually, when you framed it, you had the discussion of nobody's really looked at this, which is exactly what I had the first time on our first draft of our tabling motions paper, and I was quickly corrected on that. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with this being a paper you're sort of dusting off the shelf, all right? So there will be some lit review issues and just some literature we got to catch up with. But in terms of theory, when we think about the motion to table, is this a majority party agenda control where they're using this for to provide cover, or is this a pure efficiency story? And if you want any sort of context behind that, that Keystone debate was awesome. When it was pretty much just, is this efficiency or is this government? Do you guys want me to keep going on that?
No, good. No, you have it as long as you want, but we can move along. Jordan?
Yeah, I suppose I'll jump in. I echo what Tony has to say, and it was interesting this morning when I was reading the Goodman piece. I actually got the notification from APR that Tony's paper was coming out, so the timing of this couldn't have been better on that end.
Yeah, it was today.
I think that there is a lot to like in this. The obvious one being that we know that tabling motions are incredibly important for what gets done in the Senate, and they're understudied. Although I agree that you can't really make that case to carry a paper, but it's certainly the case. One thing that I like is that this is sort of an impressive data collection effort. We don't have a lot of data on these tabling motions. And yeah, again, the timing is kind of neat because Tony's piece is very historically oriented, and of course, this is looking at what's going on in the contemporary period. So I don't have a lot about how this is framed. I think it's framed appropriately. I guess the one thing in the framing that I might quibble with, and it's very minor, but maybe it's a suggestion that improves things, and that is that maybe the individualism angle is a tad played up, in the sense that a lot of people who have written on this topic, including Nate, have made the case that there's really not as much individualism in the Senate as a lot of people have assumed. So I think everything is fine on the framing and the front end of the paper, but that's maybe one thing that people would say is a little oversold. But this is good. There's a lot to like in this paper, so I was happy to read it.
Okay. Greg, Jason?
Okay, so on framing, one thing. Well, I can't hear myself.
Yeah, we're getting we're getting feedback from somewhere.
Yeah. All right. Well, anyway, on framing, one thing that you might play up is that one of the major forces of dysfunction in the Senate over the last, especially 8 years particularly, is a fight over amendments, and and tabling motions are an important part of it. I think if you update the data set through the 113th, what you might find is that tabling motions per se might be declining a bit, because it's become a norm now that they do amendment votes by UCA, so that senators who don't want their amendments killed by a tabling motion will try to set up some alternative process. Anyway, that's how I would say it. But I think the important thing is to start out explaining to the reader that one of the reasons Congress doesn't work well is a fight over amendments in the Senate.
Yeah, I agree that framing is sort of sides of the on this. It really needs to be more upfront about why people who don't love procedure should care about the tabling motion. And Tony's also pointing out, Craig, that you should cite him.
Hey, Jordan, you want to try muting yours real quick and see?
Yeah, I'm muted.
No, you're not. It doesn't look like yours. I can still hear you. Hit the.
That solved the problem, though.
Is that it?
Yeah, it's definitely. Well, I can still hear myself though.
I'm turning the volume way down. Maybe that'll help solve things. I don't know. Is it me?
I don't know. That's a little. Yeah, that it is. Try hitting the mute button up in the top. You see the mute microphone. Hit that and see what happens.
It's muted.
Okay. For some reason, I can still hear you. So I guess it's not. Yeah, there. Let's see. All right. Well, yeah, I can still hear a little bit. There, Jason's muted. There should be a mute like up in the top, in that bar in the top center. Like so, right in the middle of the screen. There's a little microphone line through it. Hit that. Okay. Yep. Yes. That's better.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So Jordan, when you want to talk, just hit unmute or stick a finger up, and we'll go back to you.
Okay.
All right. Great. Okay. So Jason, were you gonna jump in with something else?
No, really, I'm really with Tony on this. That I think the frame really needs to build out why we should care about this, other than just no one has worked on it. I mean, there's lots of things in the world that no one has worked on, and there's a reason they haven't worked on them, because maybe they're not interesting. So convince me why this is interesting before you start diving in, and I think that's going to be a key to making progress on this.
So let me suggest a direction that I think maybe ties together a few of these points, Craig, and forgive me for suggesting that you, in some sense, write a different paper. Although I hope there's a lot going to be usable here. But one of the consequences, I think, but also the opportunities of having had the paper on the shelf for a few years is that, that a bit of a debate has sort of formed, right? I mean, where basically, at the time that you first wrote the paper, it was basically, Rhodey and a few folks who had looked at some tabling motions, but Steve Smith in some specific parts of articles, but very little work had been done. And since then, there's been Chris and I have done a few things, and Tony's done work on it, and Steve with some students have done published work on it, and more specifically on tabling motions. And I think there's a bit of a debate has formed about whether how much tabling motions are really about trying to control the agenda, either for the party or someone else, whatever coalition might use it, or whether or not they're primarily an efficiency tool, right, a way to move forward. And I think there's room. I mean, I think that's an unresolved question. I think it's something that there's an opportunity to try to adjudicate that a bit. And I think it also provides an opportunity to reconsider some of the other procedural tools that we've categorized as agenda tools along the same lines. So, the argument that's made about special rules, of course, is that, it's partially a way to manage the agenda and partially, in some sense an efficiency tool, but I don't think it's stated quite in the same way. And so, I guess what I might push to do is to say, there's this debate about the tabling motion with respect to efficiency versus agenda control. And really, it's an opportunity for us to sort of reopen the case on a lot of procedures that actually could fit either one of these sort of purposes, and to ask what are the conditions under which, or more sort of more sweeping in a more sweeping fashion, are these tools one or the other, or what are the conditions under which they are one or the other? And so I might try to reframe the paper in the context of the current literature as a way to adjudicate those things. And then, with the data that you have, if you can sort of be clever about thinking, about deriving a hypothesis that would be, or some hypotheses that would be critical tests between these two explanations, that seems to me like a contribution, especially if you couch it in a broader set of, questions about procedure and about what the purpose of these sort of procedural time-saving things are. I think that's an avenue you could go down that would be a much more bigger contribution. Tony?
Yeah, so kind of building on Nate's point, I think I agree here. So the Smith Ostrander-Pope piece is something obviously you're going to need to go through and think about. I'm biased. I think Steve makes a pretty convincing case that, yeah, these votes are still being used. Maybe they are less traceable than votes on the actual underlying substance, but there's still votes that are being used and members are being hammered with them. And I gotta think too that it changed at some point over time, right? That before we start seeing more direct negative advertisements and more of those ads, the traceability hypothesis had a bit more to it. But I think Nate's right about reframing it. And one thing I was going to say, while I was shamelessly plugging my paper, is that if you want our data, you're welcome to it. And I think our data would take you up, so it'd be 39th Congress to whatever you have now. And one way to get at is this efficiency versus coverage question is, so in the paper, again, ours was purely historical, but we did a bit on switching. So we looked at who was actually switching their votes after the motion to table failed. When you do have a few failed tabling motions in there, and then you have the vote on the amendment. And that's something you could throw together if you wanted to. Yeah, and then I think that Keystone debate. I mean, I was just reading it right before I read your paper. There's a great Manchin quote where Democrats were complaining that, hey, look, McConnell said he was going to go regular order, whatever the hell that means. But then next thing you know, he's tabling everything. And they wanted to debate this. And Manchin said rather directly, look, the motion to table is a vote. We're getting our votes, right? That's better than we had before. And it was basically a microcosm of this academic debate that I think Nate correctly has pointed out is popping up.
Jordan, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I just have a small comment. It's kind of on the empirical side of things, but trying to get at maybe this efficiency argument. So in the model, you've got a variable for the election year, and so the hook is that this captures whether or not these motions to table are somehow trying to provide coverage for members of the majority that don't want to take politically risky votes. And I think that makes sense. I'm wondering if there's another sort of temporal variable that you could use that would maybe get at efficiency, and that is what happens in the lame duck session. Right, so if we see a lot of tabling motions in the lame duck session, it can't be about trying to avoid a politically risky vote since the election already happened. But it occurs to me that it could be in some way about efficiency. Right, at the end of the legislative session, a lot of bills are backed up, and so if we see a flurry of tabling motions, maybe it's the majority trying to just exercise some control over what's going on in the chamber so that they can actually get through all these bills that they would like to pass. So either maybe a dummy variable for the lame duck session, or I don't know if there's some sort of counter for the number of things that are on the majority's agenda at a given time, right? Like in a given month, how many different major pieces of legislation are being considered or something like that, but maybe that would in some small way get at this efficiency argument.
Okay. I think we're at a point where we can certainly open it up to discussion about the theory if there's sort of comments on that part, but of course if there's leftover framing issues, we can raise those as well. Does anyone have theoretical comments that are specific? Jace?
The big theoretical issue I have is it's not clear at all where your hypothesis 2 comes from. I think you need some sort of spatial foundation for that in some way. I think thinking about amendments spatially is actually more tricky than we think. It's not necessarily that it's not the classic bill versus the status quo. It's the proposed amendment to the bill versus the status quo. And so when you're thinking about perhaps extreme members offering amendments to bills that are on the floor, it's not clear to me why those would be more likely to be tabled. Maybe you show me spatially that makes some sense, but if they're just trying to chip it away at a bill a little bit, I'm not sure why those are going to be more susceptible to tabling motions than maybe something from. If I'm just thinking out loud about this, if I'm the majority party and I'm trying to enact something that's going to pull policy, say, to the median of my party, I'm a hell of a lot more worried about amendments coming from the chamber median than I am from the extremes. We can beat back the ones from the extremes pretty straightforward. It's the people trying to pull it to the middle that you should be worrying about if you're trying to enact a non-centrist outcome. And so I just think you really need to. It doesn't necessarily have to be a spatial setup there, but that seems to it lends itself nicely, I think, to a little more spatial reasoning there, at least to figure out where that hypothesis is coming from.
Yeah, I want to just echo Jason's point. I think he said that perfectly. And from my perspective, I agree that a spatial model would yield that, but I don't think you even need it. I mean, I think that's precisely the point. Is that put slightly differently, if we believe that tabling motions are about trying to kill things without having difficult votes, if we buy that at all, then right, you're happy to have, then it's only things that are moderate that put your moderate members in difficult situations that you're worried about. The extreme votes, right? You just let everybody vote and they fail. And that's nobody has a difficult vote, but it doesn't pass. It's not an issue. Others?
Yeah.
Tony. Oh, sorry, Greg, and then Tony. I jumped the gun.
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't think that the motion to table, tabling an amendment is fundamentally different from having a vote on the amendment, and so there isn't a lot of political cover provided by tabling rather than scheduling the vote. I mean, again, in recent years, if they don't want to vote on an amendment, they don't vote on the amendment, even if that means that the process comes to a stalemate. So, when I think about tabling motions, I mean, not to prejudge what is the question for debate, but I mean, I think of it more as a matter of efficiency, and so I guess I don't know if this is more theory or research design, but part of the question here is not just which motions succeed, which is what the paper is set up as, but which amendments get chosen for tabling motions. So, foreshadowing my methodological comments, I mean, you might also think about this as a selection process, and then try to identify which members have their amendments targeted for motions to table.
Okay, Tony.
Yeah, so I'd echo both Jason and Greg's comments and Nate's. In fact, the fact that you're seeing that extreme, especially minority party extremists, that those are getting tabled more, that strikes me as an efficiency story. Today, we see the majority loves getting these extremist amendments, especially in the House. Why? Because it lets them go on record and basically splits the minority party in certain cases. And I don't know that you need a spatial model, but I do think it kind of yields itself to that, or at least just more discussion. And I think Greg's point, too, about filling the amendment tree is spot on, right? That's an issue that probably needs to be addressed in the theory section. Ultimately, that's one of the reasons why we focused on the historical use of the motion to table in our piece. It's because you do start to see it pop up pretty regularly in the 80s, 90s, and it's a much better, if you wanted to provide cover, right? Blocking the amendment through filling the tree is the way to go about doing that. But yeah, I thought, again, I could see a good argument for why you would see extremist amendments be more likely to be tabled. But I think it's at least a efficiency thing for the minority, and then for the majority, when you see majority party extremists get tabled, then maybe that is a coverage story. I don't know. I thought that was one of the more interesting aspects of the paper.
Other theoretical comments before we move on to research design issues? Jordan?
Yeah, I mean, so this is something that I was thinking about when reading the paper, and it may take you too far astray from what you really want to do in this to be useful, but I was thinking about the theoretical debate between positive and negative agenda control, and whether agenda control is historically constant, as Cox and McCubbin's claim, or whether it varies historically. And it seems that you're sort of wedded to the idea that it's constant throughout time, and I don't dispute that. I think that's probably right. But I'm wondering, I mean, so like in the figures 1 and 2, you see some variation in the use of these motions, and so I'm wondering, is there an extent to which it does vary based on how cohesive the majority is? I mean, I think you're focusing on the right area there, but that's kind of a big theoretical debate that I was wondering about in the paper, and whether your stuff speaks to that. So.
Any others? Craig, you're welcome to jump in. If you have any responses or thoughts at any point, you're also, of course, welcome to jump in and engage.
Yeah, just a couple of quick things. I mean, responding to Jordan's point about, I've been kind of rethinking that. I spent some time going through Steve's 2013 OSQ paper, and we he kind of touched on some of that in terms of that agenda control is not necessarily a constant. And I guess after reading Steve's paper, I've kind of got the sense that we think about what agenda control means in the Senate. Maybe it's not a constant the way we think about it in the House, and I think this comes back to some of the points in terms of the big picture stuff. And Nate, you had talked a little bit about this too, in terms of how you set this up and a chance to maybe adjudicate competing theories, and again kind of put it in the big picture about how we've got the House, we've got the Senate, and trying to figure out what we mean necessarily by agenda control and the conditions under which these tools are effective. And the other thing too, especially in light of the Keystone debate that Tony referenced, I actually have the data set updated through the end of the last Congress. It's just a matter of actually finishing collecting all the contextual data to rerun the models to kind of see. And I think this gets at other points in terms of how much things have been changing, given going from the 70s where you had less ideological polarization to what we see today, which is basically pitched battles between the majority and the minority. So it'd be interesting to see if there is how some of these things have changed.
Okay. Empirical comments, research design and/or empirical issues. Greg, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. One of the things I would have liked to see is a differentiation between distance from the majority party median for minority party members versus whether the center, distance from the majority party median for moderates versus extremists. So I made a picture. I don't know if you can see that, but it's for the modern Senate, where the Republicans are in red and Democrats are in blue. And so what I would like to see is, one variable measuring, how far Democrats are from the Republican median. Another one measuring, how far, Republicans in the middle are from the median, and then, the Ted Cruz's of the world, right? How far Republicans are from the party median. And because I think there's a difference between being, at the Senate median and being, equidistant but on the extreme of your party. In the modern Senate, I think senators who are on the extremes of the party are more likely to offer amendments and try to push amendments as part of their political agenda rather than trying to amend bills. And so I'd expect to see that sort of extremists within the majority party are more likely to have their amendments tabled because they're just, they're getting their things on the agenda and they're getting their roll call votes, but they're not really contributing to the process of writing a bill that's going to pass. Whereas, senators who are more towards the middle of the chamber are more likely to have their amendments come to a final passage vote and taken more seriously. So there would be discussion and then perhaps amendments to the amendment and then an actual roll call vote on the attempt to construct the legislation. And then separately, I would also expect that among the minority party, the farther you are from the majority party or from the chamber median, the more likely you are to have your stuff tabled. Now, the paper discusses how you ran a model which calculated the ideological difference from the majority party median for the minority party members. Those results are not reported, but you explain, to your credit, the paper explains to its credit that, I tried this, it was significant for a while, then I cut out the outliers and it was non-significant. That's fine. I mean, I would still like to see that reported, but more than that, I'd actually like to see a differentiation between majority party extremists versus majority party moderates and seeing if their amendments are equally likely to be tabled.
Okay. Tony?
Yeah, just two real quick points on the empirics, and sort of echoing everybody else's point that seeing the updated data would be great. So I think you need some discussion, especially in the time period you're in, at least about the selection effect here with the tree being filled. If anything, I think that's probably going to help your case. I've been collecting data on all amendments, even those that didn't get a vote, and I think roughly around 60%. I haven't looked at it recently. Were minority party amendments that aren't getting votes, which makes sense, right? So if anything, the selection effect I think is helping you here. I'd throw in a control for committee members. All right, I think if you're on the committee, I would guess that you're going to be less likely to be tabled than extremists elsewhere. Yeah, that's all I have in empirics.
Go ahead.
All right. Yeah. So I don't have a ton on the empirics. I mean, I sort of jumped ahead to a couple of things. I noted the same point about whether there's some big selection effect going on here. So I think that if you could somehow develop a data set with all amendments and then those that are targeted for a motion to table in the first part, then maybe you could get at some of these kind of thorny theoretical issues empirically. Yeah, I think on page 15 where Greg noted that you have this additional test, but then you note that there's a bunch of outliers, and once we take out those outliers, the interaction term becomes insignificant. I think you need to go either the direction that Greg notes, which is that fully report it and discuss it, or just drop it and maybe footnote all that stuff. I think the sort of the middle ground isn't as effective as it can be. So going one direction on that. Really small thing, the predicted probabilities, I like that, but I would prefer it if you had the predicted probability for someone who is at the median and then it's one standard deviation away from the median, rather than someone who's at the mean and one standard deviation below the mean, because then I'm wondering, well, what does that mean to be a standard deviation below the party median, or the average median? So someone who's at the median, what's the predicted probability, and then someone who's a standard deviation further away. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's all I had on the empirical stuff. I would maybe add a control for whether someone is a committee chair, whether the amendment sponsor is a committee chair. But yeah, that's what I have on the empirical side.
Just real quick, I'd echo what most people said there, but on the thing Jordan was just talking about with the standard deviation above and below, why don't you just graph that effect across the range? No reason to mess around with this number, that number. Just show it graphically and be done with it.
Greg?
Quick question for Craig. Craig, is your data coded by date, or do you just have election year versus non-election year?
It's coded by date. So in the data set, basically, each time the motion to the table is offered, I've got, I know what amendment it's been offered, or I know what bill it's been offered to, and I know the date. Obviously, I know I've got, all sponsorship data. I've got some of the committee data. So yeah, I could, I'm not. What were you thinking about in terms of the date, or why would that be?
Well, you might play around with different time ranges as when Congress is more likely to table amendments. So particularly, maybe what's going on is in the last 3 months before the election, the Senate says, oh gosh, we really have to finish our work, and that's when they start tabling a bunch of amendments. Or, you could even get really more detailed, like it's right before recess that there's a bunch of motions to table. So that's just, I guess I would just, more broadly, I'd like to think about the what time periods are we more likely to observe motions to table? Because it might be more nuanced than simply election year versus non-election year.
Jordan?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Yeah, I thought of something. To what extent are these motions clustered, or do they exist? You know, do some bills have 10 tabling motions and others mostly just have one? You know, I'm thinking about what in the last Congress when Boehner promised to open up, you know, the legislative process, and we had just an amendment free-for-all on, I think, a budgetary bill. You know, are there some bills that are really dominating what's going on in the analysis because they have so many of these motions, or is it kind of a random distribution?
No, it's definitely clustered. You know, and this is consistent with Steve's article in LSQ where he pointed out, you know, towards the end that, you know, when you look historically, you know, they tend to be dominated by a relatively small number, and you know, going back through my data set as well, even as I continue to collect the data, they do tend to be overwhelmingly concentrated in a relatively small number of pieces of legislation. So it in no way looks like a normal distribution, you know, throughout the legislative process. That, you know, if you if you just thought about it visually, I mean, they would all be clustered, you know, and you wouldn't have anything that look like a normal distribution.
Jordan?
So yeah, I mean, I think yeah, well, I mean, I think that's something that should be addressed in the paper. But also, I mean, maybe you could build into your model some bill-specific factors, or you know, if you just kind of want to whitewash this, you know, maybe a multi-level model with random intercepts by bill, you know, something to account for the fact that, you know, one particular bill and idiosyncratic things going on there could be driving the entirety of the results. Something in your model to, I don't know, maybe address that. So.
Okay. Well, I think so we can open it up to any remaining comments, overall, big picture, things you left out, things that you've thought of since we started. So, Craig, what do you think? So what are you thinking in terms of where are you headed with this? You think in terms of like where would you like to submit it, and what's your timeline and plans?
I'd like to get it submitted sometime in the next couple months, and I think at this point the biggest thing I'm thinking about is, you know, how much data collection. And, you know, I mean, I've got. And I guess I was going to ask Tony about this. You know, you had mentioned collecting data on all amendments, and obviously in the Senate that gets tricky because are we talking about all amendments that come to the floor for a vote? Or are we talking about amendments that are offered and then withdrawn before anything else even happens to them? You know, I mean, I mean, from your perspective, I mean, how would you conceptualize that? I mean, because obviously senators offer a lot of amendments, but you know, many of them get withdrawn or you know postponed, or you know they get hung up on the tree and nothing happens to them because they get, you know, caught up in the fight over cloture.
Tony?
Yeah, so a couple of things on that. One, I haven't had a chance to play around too much with the GovTrack data, but it looks really nice. All right, so I mean, we've been collecting this, so we've been collecting this data by hand. I've had students doing it now for 4 years. We have something like 27,000 amendments, and it's over congressional history. But the GovTrack stuff, which is all pretty much in line with Thomas, it's just been a scraping system, I think will get you what you need pretty quick. To your point, I distinguish between an amendment that gets withdrawn and an amendment that's blocked for other reasons. And it's pretty clear when a member is going to withdraw his amendments, right? It's in there, and it's going to be in GovTrack if he ended up using that. In fact, for most of my students, I'll tell them, hey, if the amendment's withdrawn, you don't necessarily need to worry about it, because oftentimes when the amendment's withdrawn, that means the bill manager has accepted it, or they're going to bring it into conference, and I've seen this happen a couple of times. And the guy's like, look, hold off on that. I'll bring this up in conference to see if we can't push it there, right? That sort of thing. And you know, I actually bought the point that and you know, just looking at my data, a tabling motion, you're going to have a recorded vote on it. So I don't know if the all amendment data would buy you a ton more than just a recorded amendment data that you have going now. But again, like I said, you're welcome to our historical data with this too. You know, you made the point in here that this is a Bob Byrd thing, and a number of people did. Tiefer, I think, makes that point too. But historically, its use of the motion to table is pretty consistent in some Congresses. Actually, pretty high. It represented a pretty high proportion of the record in the Senate and certain Congresses too. And for a lot of the reasons why Jordan and Greg were hinting at, is it isn't necessarily. Sometimes this would happen. I think this is awesome. Awesome being relative, where somebody would basically be filibustering by amendment, and they wouldn't be filibustering the underlying bill. They'd be filibustering that bill because they know there's something coming down the pipeline that they really hate, and so they're offering a ton of amendments to try and delay consideration of the future bill, not the bill that they're actually offering the amendments on. Right? And that's actually, forget I said that. I just think that's kind of cool. But that's the regarding the amendment data stuff. I'm happy to provide it, and I think GovTrack does a good job if you don't want.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that it does is, or at least raises the question, because I think both Jordan and Greg had suggested this in terms of whether or not there's a selection effect that's at play here, in terms of what amendments are offered and what amendments are subject to being tabled, and if senators are acting strategically rather than sincerely in terms of the amendment process, what does that do to our ability to I guess model or figure out what's the best way to model the selection process if in fact senators are doing it for delay rather than substantive lawmaking.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're just going to throw open a ton of amendments to kind of slow the process down, will the selection effect really capture what's going on under those circumstances?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I also think, I have this written down here, that maybe a bit more discussion in the paper on the minority side of this would be worthwhile. We keep talking about the motion at table being used by the majority as if this is something like they're trying to avoid a pure policy debate. But we know most amendments have nothing to do with pure policy. These guys want to go on record as losing. All right, few things would bring Bernie Sanders more joy than getting struck down on that Republicans voting against him on the is there man-made global warming, all right? So maybe a bit more discussion, I think, on that end would be nice. And like I said beforehand, I really do think there's a temporal aspect here when we think about this debate about, I guess, coverage versus efficiency. I do buy that during civil rights legislation, these guys looked at this as a political coverage issue, and they were going back, like Arnold says, and explaining the one tough vote they took, right, as being, this is a procedural vote, this isn't a substantive vote. But in an era of, Congressman X voted 200 times for whatever, right, those attack ads, I think, have sort of taken over the process, and now it's changed. The incentive structure has changed. For the life of me, I don't know how to get at that, but I do think there's something to this, and it is not constant over time.
Jordan?
It's something that just occurred to me, and it might be, an additional set of empirics that maybe you could bring to bear pretty easily. I'm sure this would take about 5 minutes to compute, but what's the roll rate on tabling motions? I mean, is it zero? As you would suggest, you would think from the cartel theory, is it 10%, 20%? I'm sure in your data set you could compute that pretty quickly, and maybe it lends an additional piece of evidence to suggest what's going on here. So.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the majority doesn't lose very often, but I have to go back and look at the circumstances under which they do, and kind of look at the breakdown, and if it's, whether or not is it just a few people coming over from the, from the minority side, or if it's literally the entire minority party, with the classic role with, a small minority of the majority. But I don't know the answer to that right now.
Yeah, although, I mean, what you're really looking for is, in some ways, disappointments, right? Because the role, in some sense, on the amendment is about the disappointment on the tabling motion. So, right, it's the majority, if it's a role of the majority on a tabling motion is just, the majority trying presumably to offer an amendment that they can't get adopted, right? Right, because it's a successful tabling motion over the objection of the majority, and so what happens is that the amendment dies, against the will of the majority. But so what you really want, I mean, well, I shouldn't say what you really want, but they're very different things, right? If what you're looking for is sort of some evidence that the majority, if what you're looking for is evidence that that some other coalition is pushing through some, the majority party to get an amendment either voted on or adopted, right? What you're looking for is majority disappointments on tabling motions. And so I think it's useful to think carefully about, take one step back and think, okay, theoretically, what am I interested in, understanding here about how this tool is used and who's using it, and that will dictate which measure, is the one that you want to sort of identify as the key. Or both, right? I mean, you may be interested in both kinds of instances, just being aware that there are things, right? One is sort of a positive agenda control story, and the other is a negative agenda control story. But I guess as a final point on my end, I guess I really, I would push you hard to try to, set up a critical test of some sort, right? Because I think you're going to get a lot less mileage out of just tinkering around with tabling motions and what the votes look like, or what is sort of correlated with either passage or who offers those, than you are if you can sort of dig in a little to what the arguments are in the literature and say, all right, well, here's a particular thing, and I guess, so for me it's a little hard, at the moment to think about what exactly the test looks like, because I'm not sure what the critical hypothesis is, but I would push you in that direction, because I don't think necessarily just more data and more time is what you need. I think what you need is a cleverly conceived hypothesis that allows you to sort it out. Tony?
Yeah, no, I agree with Nate. I think again, our paper looked at, we had a similar sort of setup on it, and just this is way too narrow repeatedly, just because we're focusing purely on the motion to table, and just purely on like what gets tabled, right? I mean, we had all amendments that had recorded votes in the universe that got tabled, and that was kind of interesting. The thing that people were interested in is they did really like the switcher analysis, and so if you wanted to go the efficiency route, efficiency versus coverage, I think setting that up, and maybe, again, it's a bigger picture type issue, and it's more data. And I think what you have now could hit a lower tier Congress and presidency type journal. I don't know that, but I'm guessing it could. But if you wanted to go big picture, pull in data on points of order. Do you see switchers on points of order, and just do a bigger, like, who who we think going to get coverage switching on these things? Do a Crable type analysis on that. Cloture, do we see switchers on failed cloture motions, failed points of order, failed tabling motions? I think that was the one sort of big thing that the reviewers did like on these, at least for us.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, I think both those points are fair. I mean, especially, this is, for me, an older paper, and, the original version, would have had certain advantages in terms of, pushing this, and now I think, Nate's point is really well taken, in the sense that, just simply explaining is not as valuable, because, obviously, Chris and Nate published their book, and then Steve's article in LSQ is kind of, we kind of given us a lot of information about how the motion is used. So the next step is to really kind of push the theoretical to kind of sit down and figure out, kind of what's really going on here and what do we get out of this.
Any final thoughts, guys? Jason?
No, I agree with. I mean, we all sort of hitting on the same points. So I don't have a lot of new to add to what others are saying, but so hope this is helpful for Craig.
Yeah. Okay. Well, unless someone wants to offer a parting word, we'll wrap up. And I Jason and I really appreciate everybody participating. Craig offering up his paper for conversation, and panelists offering their time to sort of help Craig and contribute to the discussion. So
I wonder if any statues back there have anything to say, any of his figurines.
Where's that? Where's this?
But you look behind Tony, he's got a lot of observers.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I see Teddy Roosevelt back there.
And Bob Byrd. All right. Craig, good to see you again.
Good to see everybody. I appreciate y'all's comments.
You bet. Okay, guys. We'll see you later. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.